Os descendentes de Adão e Eva, teoricamente, carregam consigo o compromisso da redenção através do trabalho. Porém, as coisas aqui na Terra não são tão homogêneas assim. O fato é que alguns precisam trabalhar mais que outros, e ainda nem sempre o trabalho é suficiente para todos. Durante a Revolução Industrial do século XVIII, a grande concentração de pessoas nos meios urbanos fazia com que a mão de obra nas fábricas ficasse muito barata. Dessa forma, os trabalhadores não só ganhavam muito mal, como também eram submetidos a situações desumanas em seus locais de trabalho. Lugares escuros, úmidos, ventilação insuficiente, jornadas muito longas, enfim, era assim que se amontoavam homens, mulheres e crianças nas velhas fábricas da Inglaterra. Apesar dos horrores daquela exploração desumana, muitos trabalhadores acreditavam que havia um desafio pior. Quanto mais avançava a tecnologia das máquinas, mais riscos eles corriam de, em algum tempo, serem substituídos por essas mesmas máquinas e não terem mais como ganhar o seu pão. Assim, naquela época apareceram grupos que se propunham a destruir máquinas para proteger o futuro do trabalhador. Tudo isso parece um contrassenso. Trabalho é castigo, é coisa de pobre, mas é imprescindível. As greves e outros instrumentos de luta levaram as classes trabalhadoras a conquistar direitos ao longo desses 2 últimos séculos. Porém, ao fim do século XX, o problema do desemprego volta a ameaçar. A tecnologia introduziu inovações tão poderosas que agora um robô ou um computador substituem tranquilamente o trabalho de muitos homens. E então, o que fazer? A solução passa novamente pelo caminho das negociações e dos grandes debates éticos sobre a distribuição das riquezas no planeta. E você, já descobriu qual é o seu novo papel nessa sociedade de transição?
Aracide Almeida por Olivia Byton, no palco A Dama do Encantado, homenagem a uma das maiores cantoras da época de ouro da música brasileira.
Encontrei um pedaço na avenida de camisa amarela, cantando a flores bela, oi, a flores bela. Convidei uma voltar pra casa em minha companhia, recebi um sorriso de amiga, desapareceu um milhão da alegria.
No, it's not a bad thing. It's only a bad thing when we get in the way.
And we continually get in the way of this natural give and take of the sea. Here on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, a 1.5 kilometer section of highway has been sandbagged to prevent the dune from sweeping over the road. These houses weren't always on the beach, but because of island migration, whole rows of houses in front of them have fallen into the sea, or retreated, like this house. It's been moved back 5 times this century. Filkey says the only sensible thing to do is retreat from the sea and let nature take its course. These represent a substantial investment on the part of the owners. How do you feel about that? I mean, do you feel any sympathy for them? Or?
I feel very little sympathy for them. You have to be pretty unread not to know about storms and shoreline erosion. And to build a house here in South Nags Head with such a historically long historical record of very rapid erosion rates is madness. To build it right next to the beach.
But it's not just the mistake of the unread. This is the latest engineering solution to holding back the sea. Beach replenishment. Massive amounts of sand are dredged nearby and pumped onto the beach. This project of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers at Folly Beach, South Carolina, will cover 8 kilometers of beach using millions of cubic meters of sand at a cost of more than $8 million U.S. It will be repeated every 8 years for the next 50 years. All this to replace a beach whose erosion problem is caused by navigational jetties built just north of here by the Corps of Engineers at the entrance to Charleston Harbor. than 100 beaches on the east coast of the U.S. have been replenished like this in the last 3 decades, many by the Corps of Engineers. Replenishment, or re-nourishment as it's sometimes called, demands enormous equipment and huge sums of money. And it has other consequences.
But there's another side to this, of course. It's very costly, very temporary, and it often is the source or the reason that more dense development will come onto an island. Single-family homes will be replaced by multi-family homes or high-rises. This happened in Carolina Beach, North Carolina, Jacksonville Beach, Florida, Miami Beach, Florida. And so you end up making a community more and more inflexible as far as response to the coming sea level rise. And so replenishment can, in that sense, do pretty serious damage to the system.
Pilkey often finds himself at loggerheads with the Army Corps of Engineers, the agency responsible not only for protecting shorelines, but for changing the course of rivers, draining marshland, and other projects which have come under heavy criticism. The current director of the Coastal Engineering Research Center is Jim Houston.
There are a lot of things in this country that we've done looking back at weren't a good idea. Had many environmental consequences, and we usually didn't realize them at the time. And so you've got to balance the two. There's a balance between development and keeping things undeveloped. And I think in this country, around the world, people want some kind of balance. I don't think people want what Pilkey is saying, abandon the coast to where? We're going to move back to Toledo? I don't know.
At the Waterways Experiment Station in Vicksburg, Mississippi, the Army Corps of Engineers tries to simulate the forces that occur naturally at the shoreline. Using sophisticated equipment, they attempt to understand and predict the interaction of these forces with structures like walls and jetties. But Pilkey claims their record is poor. He says applying engineering solutions to natural processes is no way to deal with a dynamic shoreline.
It's remarkable, though, they've had a long history, the Army Corps of Engineers, and very sophisticated machinery and equipment. How could they have such a bad record?
Well, you can have all kinds of sophisticated equipment. In fact, they have, for example, fantastic equipment for measuring the shape of the seafloor off here. But that doesn't do you any good if you can't predict the behavior of sand. Now, one of the big problems with replenished beaches is that storms are the main thing that are responsible for the loss of the sand. And, you know, how can we predict the occurrence of the next storm? So I maintain, and I think many geologists agree with me, that we will begin to be able to predict the behavior of replenished beaches on the very day that we will begin to be able to predict the long-term occurrence of storms, which will never occur very likely. Not in our lifetime, not in your lifetime.
But beaches are big business. Towns all along the shoreline depend on the income they generate. Jim Houston.
I think tourism as an area of the United States is incredibly competitive. There's a good economic return. So in those cases, it makes sense to nourish beaches. You can name a lot of other cases where it doesn't make sense. And so you've got both. I don't think there's one solution for almost anything you do in this country on the coastline. In some locations, the best thing is not to develop. If you have development and it's damaged, abandon the development, as Pilkey says. At other locations, it makes sense to build a seawall.
At Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, after decades of frustration, they're taking Pilkey's advice. They're planning to move the country's tallest brick lighthouse away from the eroding shore. This postcard shows how much land used to protect the lighthouse. Today, most of it is eroded. So instead of resisting the inevitable, they're moving the historic site inland. The park ranger at Cape Hatteras is Chris Eckhart.
Well, long term, we're dealing with major erosion problems. Going back to the 1930s, a number of different procedures have been tried to stabilize the coastline. We've built some some groins on the coastline. We've employed sandbags, beach renourishment, all these different things, but long term it's just simply not working, and the bottom line is they're going to have to move the lighthouse to enable it to survive.
You're really not suggesting that we manage shorelines, but that we manage human behavior to live with the reality of nature.
Of course, that's a beautiful way to put the fact that there is no erosion problem until we get involved. I mean, no problem whatsoever. We have miles of shoreline down in this direction with nobody near the beach, and it's going back at a pretty rapid rate in some areas, but nobody cares. Nobody's crying to the Corps of Engineers. Nobody's crying to the state. So there is no erosion problem until you build something next to the shoreline to measure it by.
A look beyond any shoreline reveals how uneasy the boundary between land and water is. An intricate network of dunes, marshes, and ponds has been created over thousands of years by erosion and other natural forces. A rich and diverse community of wildlife depends on these wetlands. But throughout the world, pressure from the human community is endangering these fragile wilderness habitats. There's a place for everyone here, if we give them a chance. The entire system of wetlands is protected by a succession of sand dunes built over time by wind and waves, especially during storms. As each dune grows higher, a new ridge forms in front of it, which will in turn become a dune. These shifting sands form a foothold for sand-binding plants that allow the dunes to grow and keep them from blowing away. With each successive ridge, plants adapted to less harsh conditions appear. University of Guelph geographer Robin Davidson Arnott.
So it's important on any of these beaches that we maintain the vegetation that allows those dunes to grow. One of the things that we're trying to do, I guess, in coastal management is to try to keep the human activity, particularly the building, far enough back from those fragile dunes to preserve them and to keep that buffer and that protective dune wall in place.
Parallel to the northern shore of Lake Erie lies Long Point. This 35-kilometer sand spit has grown and shrunk over thousands of years, changing shape, constantly evolving. Dense flocks of birds are a common sight in spring and fall because Long Point lies on the path of the Eastern Flyway. It's a traditional stopover spot for migrating birds. It's also a critical staging area for a huge number of waterfowl, a place to rest and feed. Some take up temporary residence, like this golden swamp warbler, who's come all the way from South America to nest and raise its young. Erosion from these cliffs to the west is what nourishes Long Point. As waves erode one side of the spit, the currents of Lake Erie carry sediment from the cliffs to build up the other side. It's called dynamic equilibrium. If this activity were to stop, Long Point would cease to exist. But Long Point, like other wetlands, is feeling the pressures of development. Doug Petkow, whose land lies between the cliffs and the spit, wants to build a marina on his property.
In this area, it's a farming community, and jobs are very hard to get. And it's maybe not just this area, but the farming community is suffering, and this area is suffering. We don't have any industry down here. Tourism is our main industry down here. And we want to create jobs. We want to create something for the people to do down here.
Building a marina would likely involve putting jetties into the lake that could disrupt Long Point's vital supply of sand. And with a marina here, could condominiums be far behind? This has biologists like Richard Knapton worried about the fate of the marshes.
You look around here, and there seems to be an awful lot of marshland. There simply isn't a lot of marshland on a grand scale. And the creatures which depend upon the marshes are vulnerable. It's pitiful. It's pitifully small, and it's getting smaller each year. It's like a nickel and dime approach. This little piece is taken there, and that piece is taken over here, and cumulatively, they have a major impact.
New Jersey's beaches were once rich with wildlife, but hardening the shorelines with seawalls and groins has led to the destruction of its beaches, which in turn has resulted in the loss of other habitats. This is Barnegat Bay. Like Long Point, it lies in the path of the Eastern Flyway, and like Long Point, it faces increasing human intrusion. For centuries, its now endangered beaches and barrier islands have offered food and shelter to countless nesting birds, like this well-camouflaged piping plover, today an endangered species. Biologist Joanna Berger of Rutgers University has watched the changes at Barnegat Bay since the early 1970s.
We've decreased the available salt marshes by 80%. We've decreased the amount of beach by 70 or 80%. There isn't the habitat left. We have already changed the habitat so much that we can no longer say that we're going to leave the birds to their own. We have to recognize that if the birds are going to be there, we have to protect areas for them to be there. It is going to take a decision on our parts that they are important elements of the beach and that they're important experiences for people who want to come to the beach. A beach that's silent without the calls of birds is not going to be a beach that people enjoy.
To some, it's an insignificant-looking patch of sand. To a bird, it's an ideal nesting spot. It's flat and open, so you can see a predator approaching from far away. The slightest elevation in the dune provides protection from flood tides, and beach grasses offer shade for the young.
But on many beaches in New Jersey, they come out with large bulldozers, and the whole object is to clean the beach, to get rid of the elevations, because the people who come on the beach like to have a nice smooth beach to play ball on or whatever, or lie on. And they don't like to see the few little shells. They think the shells mess up the beach. So on many beaches, they have bulldozers that come out every day and sweep the beach to clean it and to change the elevation. Those beaches are sterile in terms of the birds that live there because they remove those little differences in habitat that the birds need for protection.
The shallow waters of inlets provide rich feeding grounds for birds. They're sensitive areas, the very places where the interests of birds and people often conflict.
Very few animals, or birds in particular, live here all year long. They're here for only part of the year, and then they move to another habitat, and they use large areas of the coast. And what happens when each community thinks only about their little community is that no one is thinking about the whole shore. No one is looking at it from Montauk to Cape May or from Montauk to Florida. No one is asking the question, is there enough habitat left? If I develop this beach, where is there another beach?
Although renourishment isn't as destructive as building groins and seawalls, there is still great concern about how it affects wild habitat on and near those beaches. Off many replenished beaches of southern Florida lies a biological community as complex and diverse as a tropical rainforest. Coral reefs are not only alive themselves, but create habitat for millions of other creatures that exist nowhere else on Earth. Sand, drifting from replenishment projects, can literally bury the reef alive, also killing the animals that depend on it. For tens of thousands of years, loggerhead turtles have made their remarkable journey across the seas to Florida's shores. Once they came in great numbers. Today, this prehistoric creature is threatened with extinction. No one knows how the female finds her way back to the Florida beaches where she was hatched. But about 30 years later, when she's reached maturity, she's drawn back to the Florida sands to dig her nest. It's nighttime on Jupiter Island. This 110-kilogram turtle has waited for darkness to come ashore. Any distraction or change in the natural beach habitat could prevent her from laying her eggs. Laying large clutches is the survival strategy here. In the 60-centimeter nest she has just dug, she'll deposit about 110 eggs. Each contraction yields a cluster. After she's finished, the female covers the nest and camouflages it, leaving the eggs to incubate in the warm sand. But the sand must be just right. Too dense, and the hatchlings won't emerge, or the mother will have trouble digging the nest in the first place. Even a change in the color of the sand alters the temperature of the nest. It can affect the sex ratio, or even the survival rate of the hatchlings. Once her work is done, she lets nature take its course. But today, the Florida beaches, armored, crowded, and replenished, are often inhospitable places for turtles looking to nest. Barbara Schroeder is with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection in Tequesta, Florida. She's come to examine the tracks of a turtle that tried to nest the previous night. They unfortunately tell a familiar story.
Well, the turtle came out of the water and crawled up the beach in this direction. When she got up to here, instead of encountering a natural dune or natural dune vegetation, she actually hit this vertical seawall, and she turned and crawled along it looking for a place to nest, but was unable to do that with the extension of the wall. And then she just turned out without nesting and came back along her outbound track here and returned to the water without nesting.
Even though it's common knowledge that sea turtles are threatened, development continues. On those very beaches, the animals desperately need for nesting. The situation has become so serious that even some biologists reluctantly accept the need for beach renourishment. Karen Bjorndal is head of the Center for Sea Turtle Research in Gainesville, Florida.
Of course, the best option for turtles would be if we had never developed the coastline at all. If we hadn't built condominiums there, if we hadn't built highways there, if we were allowing the barrier islands to maintain their natural ebb and flow of the coastline, that would be what was best for turtles. The reality in Florida is that we have now built condominiums and highways behind those beaches. And so that's the only reason why, in order to maintain sea turtle nesting beaches, we require renourishment.
I mean, it's a perplexing question, and for the property owner, obviously wants to protect their property. For the people that want to use the beach, they would like to see a beach there. For the animals that need to use the beach, they have to see a beach there. They don't have another alternative. They can't adapt to seawalls. They can't adapt to sand that they can't dig in. Hatchlings can't adapt to sand that they can't develop properly in. Those kinds of things are simply not possible for the animals to adapt to.
If all goes well, 2 months after the eggs have been laid, the hatchlings emerge en masse, under cover of night. In a frenzy of activity, they try to make their way to the brightest, most open horizon, the ocean. This is only the beginning of a journey fraught with many dangers, and few will survive. Who knows what sort of beach these hatchlings will find when they return to nest 30 years from now. At Annapolis Royal on the Bay of Fundy lies Canada's oldest national historic site, Fort Anne. Built hundreds of years ago, today it's in danger of slipping into the sea. Until recently, there was a salt marsh on this tidal flat in front of the fort. It was this marsh that protected the footings of Fort Anne. With its disappearance, the fort's foundation is eroding at an alarming rate. The construction in 1960 of this causeway upriver from the fort is widely believed to be responsible for the major part of the erosion problem because it changed the ocean currents that flow into the area. Biologist Graham Dayborn of Acadia University is looking for a solution.
Rather than building simply a seawall of some kind that would just stop the wave action, I think the most desirable solution would be to try and recreate the salt marsh itself, because it's a natural barrier that will grow and recede as the sea level changes and so on. Concrete barriers don't do that, and sea level is rising here on a continuing basis, so the future is going to be different from what it is now.
The plan is to stop the flow of sediment in front of the fort long enough for the marsh to reseed itself. To do that, they've erected a temporary barrier. When the tide comes in, meters in the water measure the direction and velocity of the current to determine whether a permanent barrier would allow a salt marsh to begin to form. A process that could take many lifetimes to complete.
So I'm not inclined in general to favor engineering solutions, but in this case we have a highly valuable, in fact a unique site, which if we don't do something to protect it very quickly, we're going to lose. And so we have this fundamental conflict, if you like, between what one would like to say that we have to live with the ocean as it is, but if we allow the ocean to continue working, it's going to remove something that we also value very highly.
Studying the natural physical processes that operate at the shore is what coastal science is all about. However, there are so many variables that we still don't understand the basic question of how wind and water move sand. Here, an international group of scientists is researching how dunes build up on a beach, and what better place than Long Point on Lake Erie, the largest and most dynamic freshwater spit in the world. Robin Davidson Arnott, University of Guelph.
And so what we're doing is one part of a sort of broader collection of studies that need to be done if we're going to understand the sort of natural physical processes that build the beach. And then ultimately we can take that knowledge and apply it to the management of the beach, and more particularly to the management of people's activities, to make sure that we remove them from possible dangers from that, but also that we act in a sort of environmentally responsible way and preserve those portions of the beach that are necessary to protect the areas behind.
You don't have to be a scientist to know that these cottages at Long Point are standing in the worst possible place, right in the middle of the dune, the barrier that could protect them in a storm. So it shouldn't come as a surprise if they end up like Jake and Libby's place, which was destroyed along with several other cottages in the storm of December 1985. While trying to protect themselves, cottagers have made the same mistakes here at Long Point as on the coasts of New Jersey and North Carolina.
As we start putting up structures, seawalls, putting in rubble and concrete, and a whole range of other shore protection measures, it stops the shoreline from moving. The water gets deeper and deeper close to shore. And then in a storm, you've no longer got a nice, gently sloping beach, which absorbs all that wave energy. And in the storm, then the wave energy reaches right to the shoreline. It goes over the shore protection structures. And in the December 2nd storm, it actually lifted many of the cottages right off their foundations and carried them right across the old dune into the marsh behind. So the lesson we learned from this is that this is not the right place to build.
At Duck, North Carolina, the Army Corps of Engineers is monitoring the movement of sand and water on the part of the beach that no one sees.
Okay, Brian, looks like you're about 10 feet south. Come on north a little bit.
This buggy, called the Crab, can go into 10 meters of water. It's used to measure and predict how storms affect the shape of the sea floor over time. Bill Berkmeyer is director of the Field Research Facility.
We now can paint sort of a picture of how active the nearshore is, where the sand moves, where it comes from, and under what conditions it moves offshore or alongshore. When we have a big storm, the beach is eroded. We know that a lot of that sand, we don't have to respond with that same quantity of sand because a lot of that sand will come back. It takes a while, but it will come back, particularly in the summertime. And we know also that the sand, when it comes off the beach during a storm, doesn't go that far. A lot of it stays in very shallow depths.
But will science ever be able to answer the major questions about the behavior of beaches? Orrin Pilkey.
In reality, I think not within my lifetime will we answer these questions. Maybe in nobody's lifetime, because there are too many unknowns and too many uncertainties and too much random variation of storm energy, seasonal differences and decade differences and so forth.
But in spite of all warnings, in the winter of 1993, the Corps of Engineers was replenishing Folly Beach. And folly, it turned out to be.
I have a friend who says in a way that a lot of people like to look at the situation that nature always bats last at the shoreline, and that's really true. It's no question about it, and we got to remember that.
And in March 1993, nature threw one of its curveballs. While the Corps of Engineers was still only halfway through its project, the storm of the century hit Folly Beach, South Carolina, with hurricane-force winds. People lost their lives along the path of the storm as it traveled up the East Coast. The next day, the local marina told the tale. And this is what remained of yesterday's replenished beach. The Corps said the lost sand was in the surf zone doing its job protecting property. Local residents were not so sure.
Yesterday, or the day before yesterday, we had beautiful beach. And then we had the storm yesterday, and now most of it is gone again. And I have lived at other beaches where I've seen renourishment done and other things tried, and nothing has kept. The ocean will take the beach when the ocean wants to take the beach.
You know, it's nice to live on the water. And, you know, I don't think it's crazy. I just wouldn't make long-term plans, I think, if I lived on this stretch of beach.
But I think we are capable of stopping erosion along our shoreline at great economic cost and at even greater environmental cost. And why do we want to stop it anyhow? We got lots of land back in Wyoming.